So to get started, hello everyone, my name is Abby Salmon and my major is sports data analytics. And tonight I will be talking about correlations between player psychology and performance, and specifically focusing on emotion and how that influences performance within female volleyball athletes. And so before I get started, I'd like to take a second and ask you all to kind of imagine a time where you were so frustrated or so nervous about something, like even though you knew that you could perform this action, you just could not. And understanding how emotion directly plays into how a person is able to perform certain actions within sport, you're then able to implement certain strategies or certain intervention techniques to then help them kind of utilize that emotion to the best of their capability. And it's also important to note that this can also be used outside of the sport. But for now, we'll just stick with sport. And so as kind of like the basis of my study here, the sport emotion questionnaire is developed by Jones et al. In 2005 really played a big role. Please note that this is not the entire questionnaire. This is just a part of it, so that way you're able to read it on the screen. And as you can see, there is a list of certain feelings that athletes, sport performers typically experience throughout competition, and then they are asked to rate how much that they are feeling that emotion. So like I said, I kind of used this questionnaire as a sort of basis for the development of my study, mainly focusing on 3 of the 5 emotional categories that are featured: anxiety, anger, and excitement. And so these are the 3 emotions that I really focused on in this study, with anxiety and anger both being negative emotional states. Negative, another word for that would be unpleasant, because emotion can't necessarily be called negative, even if it is helping. And so the other one was more the kind of positive or pleasant emotion that I included. So that way, the combination of both negative and positive emotions would then be able to help me understand the athlete's emotional level at a more cohesive, generalized way. And I also want to point out that even though anxiety and anger are classified as negative emotions, that it's still possible for those emotions to help better an athlete's performance, mainly depending on whether the athlete views that emotion as facilitative or debilitative. And so there has been previous research and previous theories that have been developed in order to attempt to explain this relationship. And I want to focus on 3 in particular. Starting with the drive theory, we see that it's a very linear relationship between emotion and arousal and performance, with arousal levels rising, meaning that performance automatically rises. And the inverted U hypothesis then can kind of be seen as a step up from the drive theory, meaning that while it still agrees that at first, as arousal increases, so does performance, it does only do that until a certain extent, which then any further increases in arousal then result in decreases in performance. And finally, the eyes-off model, which, like the inverted U for drive theory, is kind of a step up from the inverted U hypothesis, meaning that it still kind of follows that in-shaped U shape, but it keeps in mind that this optimal level of arousal can be different for each athlete, just depending on whether they view their emotion as facilitative or debilitative, or other personality aspects that play into that as well. And so there hasn't been very much research within volleyball specifically, and also even within team sports specifically. A lot of previous research actually focuses on athletes that only perform individual sports rather than team sports. So Campbell et al. Back in 2018, they identified this gap in research. So they attempted to understand the relationships between emotion and performance within volleyball specifically. And they also mentioned that there's some sort of duality with the way emotion is felt among team sport athletes as opposed to individual sport athletes. What I mean by that is that if you're a team sport athlete, you can feel the emotions that you're feeling through an individuality focus, or even a collective team focused. So providing those two sort of identities or aspects to the emotional levels that they're feeling. And ultimately, their research concluded that emotion didn't really have any significant influence on how well that athlete was able to perform. And so considering this, I decided to conduct my own study, also using volleyball athletes, but instead of a semi-pro team from Europe, I utilized a Southern California Division III volleyball team. And the main materials that I used for this study was a modified version of the SEQ, which I mentioned earlier and showed you earlier, except I shortened it for the sake of time and also added an initial screening question that it was a yes or no question that gauged the athlete's emotional or overall emotional levels throughout the day. So that way I could potentially identify future outliers. Now, before I continue on explaining my study, I feel like it is imperative that I provide a basic understanding of volleyball as a sport. And so in volleyball, team sport with a bunch of different types of positions, and these different positions, they all have vastly different roles from each other. And so because of that, they also form different techniques from each other. So to kind of further explain that, one position could be setting throughout the entire match, while another position doesn't set at all during a match. And so with that being said, the performance of each athlete, even going across positions, it can't be compared very well. And so with that, I identified that there was a need for specialized statistics and metrics based on position. And so my data collection for this study was essentially split into two different parts. The first being the emotional data collection, which was the athletes filling out the SEQ and bringing those back to me so that way I can collect that data. And the second part was then the performance data collection, which was keeping stats and developing those metrics that I had previously mentioned on the other slide, and developing performance scores for each athlete. And so here is a table that I pulled directly from my paper. This table identifies the positions and the metrics that I designed for each of them. So for example, we have a setter. Their common skills are setting, serving, and digging. So their performance measuring statistic only features stats that focus on setting, serving, and digging. And like I mentioned earlier, potentially a middle block or an opposite, they don't do those techniques. So they have vastly different performance measuring metrics for them. And so after data collection was completed, I then utilized Python to create a program which took these inputs, these emotional score inputs and these performance score inputs, and generated two outputs that would help me kind of understand and see what sort of relationships go on between emotion and performance. The first being Spearman's correlation coefficient, and the second being a plot of data points along with a decision boundary that was developed through logistic regression. Spearman's correlation, as many people may not be aware of, there are actually multiple different types of correlation coefficients, the most commonly used one being Pearson's correlation. And so like Pearson's correlation, Spearman's correlation also identifies strength and direction of a relationship, ranging between -1 and +1. However, I chose this one as opposed to Pearson's because it works well with ordinal data, meaning that the intervals between each data point varies throughout the data set. And so because of this, as you can see on this image over here, Spearman's correlation is far more resourceful in identifying correlations in nonlinear data as opposed to Pearson's correlation. And logistic regression also is a tool that's used to identify relationships between two variables. However, it's important to point out that there must be a binary outcome. So what I mean by that is using this image over here, here we have the circle class, and over here we have the square class. So those are our two potential outcomes based on our two variables, which in the case of my study, one variable along the x-axis would be emotional levels, and the other variable along the y-axis would be the performance score levels. And our two binary outcomes would then be successful performance or unsuccessful performance. And the decision boundary helps us visualize this relationship as seen through the red line right here. And so this line, it separates the two outcomes. And if it's a well-fitting line, well-fitting, I mean, to the data set, it can then be used to serve as a predictive model, utilizing the X inputs and generating a potential Y output. So essentially, if this model worked well, in my case, I would be able to take an athlete's emotional scores and predict their performance. And so moving on to our results finally. So to start off, we have our setters, and we see that our Spearman's correlation is actually pretty low with a 0.127. So it's not very strong, although there is some relationship there. And this decision boundary, we see that it drops off first. So as emotional scores increase, then performance actually decreases as well. But then it turns around as meaning that as emotional scores continue to increase, then so do performance scores. And the next positional grouping was the defensive specialists and liberos. And as you can see here, they also did not have very much of a relationship according to Spearman's correlation, even though it was slightly stronger than the previous one. And their decision boundary was kind of the opposite from the setters, meaning that as emotional scores increased to start with, then so does their performance, but then it drops off, almost like that inverted U shape that I had mentioned at the beginning. And the next position was outside hitters. So this is our first offensive position, where they actually had a very, very slight negative relationship, but still the relationship is not very present, where we have a really sharp, really fast increase in emotional scores. Like as those increase, then our performance scores also increase very quickly. But then it starts to plateau at around about 0.45. And then with the middles and opposites, another offensive position, we kind of see a similar pattern where we have a sharp increase, but then it plateaus. As opposed to outside hitters, it only plateaus at about 0.25. And we also have another negative correlation. However, it is not very strong. And so with that being said, we were not able to find very many or very much of a relationship at all, especially not a significant one. And this is comparable to the study that I had mentioned previously by Campo et al., where they did not find any conclusive results either. And so with this being said, it leads to that question, and it leads me to assume that that duality that they had mentioned in how athletes experience emotion, how team sport athletes experience emotion, actually leads to changes as to how emotion affects performance compared from team athletes to individual athletes. And like with any responsible researcher, I do want to point out my limitations, since there were plenty of data points where I was able to have emotional scores, but no corresponding position or performance scores. I did have to eliminate quite a bit of data and exclude it from the study. And also splitting the performances by position and splitting that data and the analyses by position also led to smaller sample sizes. So of course, this means that the findings of my study, while they may not be able to be generalized to other teams or other situations just yet, I still feel like it's very important that we identify this kind of blatant lack of relationships as to how emotion does influence performance, how we were able to see, like, as a matter of fact, in this case, specifically, it didn't really influence it very much at all. And so with that being said, I feel like this study, as I've given like a pretty cohesive and thorough methodology, I feel like it can be applied to other team sports, other future studies where maybe we do focus on the roles that personality does play, and that duality between experiencing emotion plays into how an athlete's emotional levels does affect their position or does affect their performance. And so that concludes my presentation. I just want to say thank you before I open it up to questions. Specifically, thank you to my sponsor, Dr. Ann Hickey. It's been such a pleasure working with you over the past year. Thank you to WSP, the professors and the students, for creating a community where I've been able to combine my passions for these past 3.5 years. And of course, a thank you to my family as well for being here tonight and supporting my academic endeavors as much as my athletic ones. So thank you very much.